Italy sits in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea like a boot kicking into the water, and for thousands of years it has been one of the busiest crossroads on Earth. Armies marched through it, traders sailed around it, empires rose from it, and empires fell on top of it. And for just as long, historians have told a fairly simple story about who the Italian people actually are: descendants of ancient tribes, descendants of Rome, a people rooted deeply and cleanly in the land they still live on today. Then scientists began pulling DNA out of old bones, and that simple story started to fall apart. What ancient DNA revealed about the Italian Peninsula did not just add a footnote to the history books. It rewrote entire chapters. The ancestors of modern Italians turn out to be a mixture so complicated, so layered, and so surprising that it makes the traditional story look almost like a comforting myth. The DNA does not just complicate where Italians came from. It shows that Italy was being remade again and again by waves of people arriving from every direction, long before anyone had ever heard the word Roman. To understand what the genetics overturned, you first need to understand the story most people believe for a very long time. For centuries, the picture of Italian identity was built mostly on written history and archaeology. Rome, the story goes, grew out of small tribal settlements along the Tiber River, tribes that were already living in central Italy for a very long time before the city itself was founded. From there, according to the traditional account, an unbroken thread of population and culture supposedly ran forward, from early Latin tribes, through the Roman Republic, through the Roman Empire, and eventually into the medieval and modern populations that call Italy home today. It was a tidy story, ancient roots, a shared homeland, a people who had more or less always been there. But there were always cracks in that story, even before DNA testing became possible. Italy sits at the crossing point of 3 continents. Africa is close enough to reach by boat. The eastern Mediterranean funnels people in from Greece and Anatolia and the Near East. Central Europe presses down from the north through the Alps. Anyone looking honestly at a map could see that a place this exposed, this central, this easy to reach by land and by sea, was extremely unlikely to have stayed genetically isolated for thousands of years. And there were older mysteries too, mysteries that never fully went away no matter how many times historians tried to explain them. The most famous of these mysteries involves the Etruscans, a civilization that thrived in central Italy long before Rome became powerful, a civilization with a language that doesn't clearly relate to any other known language in Europe, and burial customs, art, and religious practices that looked strikingly different from their neighbors. Ancient writers themselves were confused about where the Etruscans came from. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that they had migrated from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. Other ancient writers insisted they were native to Italy and had always lived there. For over 2,000 years, nobody could settle the argument. Archaeology alone could not answer the question. Language alone could not answer the question. Only biology would eventually be able to answer it, and biology needed ancient DNA to speak. Then there's the story of Rome itself. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Syria in the east. Millions of people moved through that empire as soldiers, as slaves, as merchants, as officials, as settlers. Rome pulled in people from every province it controlled and funneled huge numbers of them back to the Italian Peninsula, especially to the city of Rome itself, which at its peak may have held close to 1 million residents drawn from every corner of the ancient world. Historians always suspected this had to have left a genetic mark, but suspecting something and proving it with hard biological evidence are two very different things. For a long time, the only tools available to study Italian origins were archaeology, written history, and studies of the DNA of living people today. Each of those tools had real value. None of them could fully settle the argument. Archaeology can show you objects, pottery, buildings, tombs, but objects don't always move with the same people who made them, and ideas can spread through trade and contact without any actual movement of population. Written history is often biased, incomplete, or simply missing for the periods that matter most. And studying the DNA of living people, while useful, is a bit like trying to read a book after several hundred more chapters have been written on top of the original pages. Modern Italian DNA carries the layered signal of thousands of years of history all mixed together and untangling which wave of migration contributed what became incredibly difficult without something to compare it against. That comparison point finally arrived when scientists learned how to extract and read DNA directly from ancient skeletons. This was the breakthrough that changed everything. Researchers could now go directly to burial sites scattered across the Italian peninsula, ranging from the earliest farming communities thousands of years before Rome, through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age, through the height of the Roman Empire, and all the way into the medieval period, and pull actual genetic material out of the bones themselves. For the first time, scientists were not looking at a blurry composite of everything that ever happened. They were looking at direct snapshots of specific people who lived at specific moments in time. And what those snapshots revealed turned out to be far more dramatic than almost anyone had expected. The first surprise came from deep in prehistory, long before anything resembling Rome existed. The earliest inhabitants of the Italian Peninsula, going back to the time right after the last ice age, were hunter-gatherers with a genetic profile quite different from the populations that followed them. Then, starting roughly 8,000 years ago, a wave of farmers began arriving in Italy from the eastern Mediterranean, bringing agriculture with them from the region of modern-day Turkey and the Near East. This wasn't simply an idea spreading from village to village. The DNA shows an actual population moving in and largely replacing, or at least heavily mixing with, the hunter-gatherers who had lived there before them. Farming didn't just arrive in Italy, farmers arrived in Italy. Then came another wave, thousands of years later, this time flowing down from the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, the same enormous wave of steppe ancestry that transformed the genetic landscape of nearly all of Europe during the Bronze Age. People carrying this steppe-related ancestry moved into Italy and mixed with the farming populations already living there. And this mixture became the genetic foundation for the populations who would go on to build the Iron Age cultures of the peninsula, including, eventually, the earliest Romans themselves. So even before we get anywhere near the founding of Rome, the Italian peninsula had already been shaped by at least 3 separate major waves of migration and mixture. Hunter-gatherers, farmers arriving from the Near East, and steppe-related populations arriving from the north and east. The idea of a single, pure ancient Italian population, sitting untouched in one place since the dawn of time, was already looking shaky before Rome had even been founded. And then came the Etruscan question, the mystery that had puzzled historians for over 2,000 years. When researchers finally managed to extract and analyze ancient DNA from Etruscan burial sites, the results surprised almost everyone, though probably not in the way either side of the ancient argument expected. The genetic ancestry of the Etruscans turned out to closely match the genetic ancestry of their Latin-speaking neighbors, the very same populations that would go on to build Rome. In other words, the Etruscans were not a mysterious foreign population that had sailed in from Anatolia and settled down as strangers among the locals, as Herodotus had claimed all those centuries ago. Genetically, they looked essentially like everyone else living in central Italy at the time. But here's where it gets interesting, and where the old 2,000-year-old argument turns out to have missed the real point entirely. The Etruscans were genetically similar to their neighbors, yet their language, their religious practices, and much of their culture were strikingly different. What this tells researchers is that language and culture do not always travel together with large population movements. A group of people can share almost identical ancestry with their neighbors and still develop or inherit or preserve a completely distinct language and cultural identity. The Etruscan mystery wasn't really a mystery about where a population physically came from. It was a mystery about how culture and language can diverge from biology entirely, something the ancient world simply had no framework to understand, and something modern historians spent 2,000 years trying to force into the wrong kind of explanation. If the Etruscan discovery reshaped one corner of Italian history, what happened next reshaped nearly the entire picture, because the biggest transformation of all took place during the height of the Roman Empire itself. When researchers studied ancient DNA from burial sites in and around the city of Rome, spanning the period from the founding of the city through the imperial era and beyond, they found something remarkable. During the height of Roman imperial power, the genetic makeup of the population living in the city of Rome shifted dramatically. Ancestry linked to the eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, and the region around modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Greece became dominant among the people buried in and around the city. This wasn't a small trickle of new arrivals blending in slowly at the edges. This was a genuinely massive transformation, one that lines up almost perfectly with everything historians already knew about the scale of Roman trade networks, mass slavery, forced resettlement, military recruitment from conquered provinces, and the sheer gravitational pull that the city of Rome exerted on the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Think about what this actually means. At the height of its power, the population living in the very capital of the Roman Empire, the city that gave Latin culture its name and its center, was overwhelmingly shaped by ancestry from the eastern provinces the empire had conquered. Rome did not simply rule over a diverse empire from a distance. Rome, the city itself, became genetically transformed by that empire, absorbing enormous numbers of people from the very lands it had conquered. And then, just as dramatically, the story shifts again. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as the imperial system that had been pulling people toward the city collapsed, the genetic makeup of the population in and around Rome shifted once more. Ancestry linked to Central and Northern Europe became much more prominent, lining up closely with the historical record of Germanic and other northern populations, moving into Italy during the chaotic centuries following Rome's collapse. The city that had been reshaped by the East during the height of empire was reshaped again by the North during the centuries of its decline. What all of this reveals, laid out plainly, is that the population of Italy, and especially the population of the city of Rome itself, was never a fixed, stable thing sitting quietly through history. It was constantly being remade. Farmers arriving from the Near East thousands of years before Rome existed. Steppe populations arriving from the east and north during the Bronze Age. A massive influx of Eastern Mediterranean ancestry during the height of imperial power. A significant wave of Northern and Central European ancestry following the empire's collapse. Layer after layer after layer, each one leaving its mark on the DNA of the people who came after. The old simple story, an unbroken thread running cleanly from ancient tribes through Rome and into modern Italians, simply does not survive contact with the actual genetic evidence. What survives instead is something far messier, and honestly, far more interesting. Modern Italian ancestry is not a single thread. It is a rope made of many different threads, twisted together over thousands of years, each thread contributed by a different wave of people arriving from a different direction at a different point in history. The genetics also reveal something about the sheer diversity that existed within Italy at any single moment in time, not just across the centuries, but within individual generations. Studies of burial sites from the Roman imperial period show that even within single cemeteries from the same time period in the same city, individuals could carry wildly different ancestral backgrounds. Someone with ancestry, tracing back primarily to the Eastern Mediterranean, might be buried within a few feet of someone whose ancestry traced primarily to North Africa, who might in turn be buried near someone whose ancestry pointed toward Northern Europe. Rome, at the height of its power, was not simply an empire that ruled over diverse populations scattered across its provinces. The city, at its very center, was itself one of the most genetically diverse places on the entire planet at that point in human history. This lines up with what we already knew from written history, that Rome pulled in people from every corner of its territory, but the DNA gives that historical picture a level of concrete, individual detail that written records alone could never fully provide. There is also a quieter, more personal layer to this story, one that comes from studying not entire populations, but individual people. Researchers have been able to trace, in remarkable detail, the specific ancestral background of individuals buried in Roman-era cemeteries, sometimes even identifying that a single person buried in Italy carried ancestry that traced directly back to a very specific and distant region, someone born far away who ended up living, dying, and being buried on the Italian Peninsula. These are not abstract statistics. These are individual human lives, people who were born in one part of the ancient world and ended up, whether through trade, through slavery, through military service, or through simple opportunity, living out their lives in Italy. The DNA turns the abstract idea of Roman connectivity into something startlingly personal. What this body of evidence ultimately reveals is not a single dramatic reversal, not one clean moment where scientists proved that Italians actually came from somewhere else entirely. It is something more layered and, honestly, more true to how human history actually works. Italy was never a closed, isolated homeland populated by one unbroken ancestral line. It was one of the most connected, most frequently remade places on the entire planet, a peninsula that pulled in farmers from the Near East, herders from the steppe, traders and slaves and soldiers from every province of an empire that spanned 3 continents, and later, populations moving south from the collapsing edges of that same empire's northern frontier. The Etruscans, once thought to be foreign outsiders, turn out to have been genetically almost identical to their neighbors, a reminder that language and culture can diverge sharply from biology. The city of Rome, once imagined as the pure heart of a distinctly Italian civilization, turns out to have been genetically transformed more than once by the very empire it built, and the modern population of Italy carries the layered evidence of every single one of these transformations, folded quietly into DNA that most people walking around today have never had any reason to examine closely. None of this diminishes what the Roman world actually built. If anything, it makes that achievement more remarkable, not less. An empire that managed to pull people together from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, and that left its genetic fingerprint not on some distant province, but on the very city at its own center, was not simply ruling over a diverse world from a comfortable distance. It was, at its very heart, a living product of that diversity. The city of Rome was not just the empire's capital. It was, quite literally, made out of the empire itself, one migration, one marriage, one buried skeleton at a time. And the story is still not entirely finished. Ancient DNA research on the Italian Peninsula continues, with new burial sites being studied, new time periods being examined, and new details being added to a picture that keeps getting more complicated with every new set of bones scientists are able to analyze. What began as a fairly simple, comforting story about an ancient people rooted cleanly in one place has become something closer to the truth of how most places on Earth actually came to be populated, through wave after wave of arrival, mixture, and change, stretching back far longer than anyone had ever assumed. The old idea of a single, ancient, unbroken Italian bloodline running cleanly from the earliest tribes through Rome and into the present day simply does not hold up against the evidence buried in the bones themselves. What the DNA reveals instead is a peninsula shaped again and again by people arriving from the east, from the north, from across the sea, each wave leaving something behind, each layer folding into the next, until the people living in Italy today carry within them a genetic record of nearly the entire ancient world. The ruins are still standing across Italy today, the broken columns, the old city walls, the amphitheaters where crowds once gathered from every corner of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. For centuries, those ruins were read as monuments to a singular, distinctly Italian civilization, built by one people for one people, rooted in one unbroken line stretching back into the deep past. The DNA tells a different story, and in many ways a far more remarkable one. It tells the story of a peninsula that became great, not because it stayed the same, but because it never stopped changing, absorbing wave after wave of new people, new ancestry, and new blood, until the very idea of a single pure Italian origin dissolves quietly into what the science actually shows. A story written not by one people, but by many, arriving from every direction, meeting on one peninsula, and becoming together something entirely new.